Hey guys, so I need you to get a highlighter out. I need you to make sure you have your guided notes, chapter 10, section 2. We are going to go through what you guys have already read, but based on the exit slip scores and looking at your Cornell notes, I feel like we missed a little bit, so I want to touch back over this section before your quiz. Your quiz will be on probably Friday. Chapter 10 quiz on Friday. So today we're going to talk about the Harlem Renaissance. Just to review, I need you to highlight when we say highlight, and I need you to answer the questions on the back of your notes when they come up in the lecture. This is going to be worth points, so make sure you fill in your guided notes and you answer the questions. Alright, to start, we will just go over the transformations in African American community contributing to the blossoming of black culture centered in Harlem. Harlem Renaissance is talking about a time period, and there's a big art movement going on in New York, and this is caused by a huge migration of the southern blacks to the northern area. And they take interest in art and music and writing and things like that create this movement called the Harlem Renaissance. So, have your highlighter ready, have your notes out. Go ahead and highlight whatever is in yellow on your screen. So the first bullet here, it tells you that Harlem became a favorite destination for black Americans migrating from the South. So, Harlem is the place we're going to talk about. Life was pretty difficult for African Americans in the South. You had a lot of sharecroppers, and if you guys remember, we already talked about what that was. That is where you pretty much rent the land by borrowing land all year, and then when you sell your crops, you have to share a portion of that to whoever owned the land that you were working. But it was really hard for African Americans to get out of debt, and so they wanted to move north and try to start fresh. They looked to find freedom and economic opportunities. Gotta highlight that. And during World War I, they were offered those opportunities because jobs were available. There was a demand, for a lot of equipment, a lot of supplies, and they needed the factories to produce large amounts. So they hired African Americans in those factories to fill those jobs. Newspapers spread the word of opportunities in northern cities, and African Americans started moving from the southern states to the northern states. This became known as the Great Migration. So on your notes there, go ahead, put a little star after you highlight the Great Migration, because that's one of the main things we're going to talk about with this section. Alright, now flip your notes over on the back. The first question, all I want you to do, write number 1. The unofficial capital of African American culture and activism in the United States in the 20s is A, Detroit, B, St. Louis, C, Harlem, D, Chicago. So out of those places, what is the unofficial capital of American culture, African American culture? Alright. Flip your notes back over. And now we're on African Americans after World War I. Okay, now I already told you that a lot of African Americans moved to the north because they wanted to find job opportunities during the war. After the war, men are coming home from World War I, and they're going to find a shortage of jobs because women and African Americans have filled those jobs. So this created a rift between the whites and the African American workers, and there's a lot of racial tension that comes out of that. There were a lot of riots that occurred because of this. About 24 other cities broke out into these racial riots in 1919. Alright, so 2 things to highlight on this slide. And then I want you to flip your notes over to your next question. When African American soldiers returned from serving in World War I, what did they find? A, a shortage of jobs. B, a decreased racial tension in northern cities. C, widespread acceptance as a result of their military service. Or D, a population shift from urban to rural areas. What did they find? All you have to write is number 2, and write your answers on the back of your notes. Okay, flip back over. We are going to go through the expectations of African Americans after World War I. A lot of African Americans believed that they had volunteered their service during World War I and that they had earned greater freedom for helping that fight. Unfortunately, not everyone agreed on that their service was enough, and that it was enough to grant them that freedom. And that's what we talked about yesterday. You read about and watched the video of the KKK and their growing violence and attitudes towards African Americans. All right, and those were the whites that were determined to strike back against the new African American attitudes. Okay, our next slide here, you have 3 things to highlight. I already said that Harlem becomes the unofficial capital of African American culture. Most of the people came from Harlem from the South. They settled there, and they started developing art, writing, music, things like that. A key figure in the Harlem Renaissance, or the Harlem's rise, is going to be W.E.B. Du Bois. And we've already talked about him numerous times, so you should know that he helped found the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. That would be the NAACP. All right, and they fought for African American rights. He also served as an editor of a magazine, and this was a major outlet for African American writing. So all of that new writing coming out of Harlem was published in W.E.B. Du Bois magazine. All right, and that last bullet there is probably one of the most important. The movement was known as the Harlem Renaissance. So I want you to highlight it, but also want you to know what the Harlem Renaissance is. Okay, that's the movement of art, production of writing, culture, all of that going on in Harlem during the 20s. All right, next person we're going to talk about is Marcus Garvey. And Garvey and W.E.B. Du Bois are not going to really agree on their attitudes and their ideas. He wanted African Americans to go back to Africa. He wanted them to create an empire there, and he actually came up with a group where their slogan was "Back to Africa." Okay, he thought that they would gain more power going back to, their home country and starting an empire there. All right, and he thought that was the only way they were going to have economic success. All right, so about 2 million African Americans are going to join his group called the UNIA. And again, this is kind of a differing idea from W.E.B. Du Bois. So flip your notes over. On the back, I want you to write number 3. And your question here asks about the key slogan that served as a rally cry for members of Marcus Garvey's Universal Negro Improvement Association, the UNIA. A, if it's not us, who? If it's not now, when? B, no justice, no peace. C, back to Africa. Or D, by whatever means necessary. So on the back of your notes, write number 3, A, B, C, or D. All right, again, I mentioned that Marcus Garvey and W.E.B. Du Bois did not see eye to eye on things. Garvey thought the NAACP discouraged African American self-confidence, and W.E.B. Du Bois and the NAACP were suspicious of the activity of the UNIA. There was an investigation into the group. The FBI actually charged the UNIA with mail fraud, and the group is going to collapse when Marcus Garvey is sent to prison. All right. The next slide, you have a few things to highlight here. Harlem in the 20s is going to be home to tens of thousands of African Americans. Again, many from the Deep South coming to the northern cities, and they felt a strong sense of racial pride. The Spirit attracted a historical influx of talented African American. These were writers, thinkers, musicians, artists, all producing work that are going to result in the Harlem Renaissance. So that second bullet is very important. All right, writers like Zora Neale Hurston, who you read about on Friday, and James Weldon Johnson are going to write of facing white prejudice. Okay, so the discrimination they face, the prejudice they face, they are going to put those feelings into writing. Poets like Claude McKay and Langston Hughes are going to write of Black defiance and hope for the future. All right, these poets recorded the distinctive culture of Harlem in the 20s, and we're going to look at some of those writings today. Black artists are going to become pretty famous during this era, focusing on the experiences of African Americans. You have a few there at the bottom. Your next question here refers to the writers. A common theme in the work of Claude McKay, Langston Hughes, and other writers active during the Harlem Renaissance was the importance of, and write this on the back of your notes, this will be number 4, A, pacifism in the face of violence, B, education's ability to help students rise above present hardships, literature in the public school curriculum, or D, defiance in the face of white prejudice. All right, Claude McKay and Langston Hughes. All right, and the last 2 slides talk about the musicians that were famous during the Harlem Renaissance. It created new opportunities for African American stage performers, and they were offered serious roles just starting in the 20s. So you have a few here: Paul Robeson, Josephine Baker, all that were taking part in these roles as stage performers. All right, the musicians are going to take on a new type of music at the time. This was considered jazz, which was a musical blend of several different forms from the Lower South with new innovations in sound. So I highlighted that. I read it word for word because I want you to know the book definition. So go ahead and highlight that. Make sure you know what that term means. And Harlem is going to introduce this in the 20s. Much of jazz was improvised. Okay, so that means it was composed on the spot. Here you have Bessie Smith was a very famous jazz performer, and we're going to listen to one of her songs in just a second. But make sure you have your notes filled in. Make sure you have them highlighted. If you need to go back, just rewind and listen to that again. You should have all your notes filled in, all the blanks, and you should have 4 questions on the back. Just label them 1, 2, 3, and 4, and put A, B, C, or D for your answers. These are going to be turned in to give you guys participation points, and after looking at your all's grades, some of you need them. All right, now you're going to go, you're going to work on your worksheet that I have on the board for you next, and then you are going to listen to some links on Google Classroom. I'll see you guys later.